Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring a subject that remains one of humanity's darkest chapters, the Holocaust. Within this awful historical event is an extraordinary and little-known story, the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz. My guest on this episode is Anne Sebba, a renowned historian, journalist and author who specialises in uncovering powerful human-centred stories from history, particularly those involving remarkable women. Anne's latest book explores the story of the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, a group of women forced to perform music under unimaginable conditions as prisoners in one of the most infamous concentration camps. In our discussion, Anne explains how she discovered this powerful narrative through a surprising personal link. We also look at the challenges experienced by the women who relied on music as a lifeline for survival. We discuss the transformative power of music, the ethical and emotional challenges Anne faced in researching and writing about this sensitive topic, the dilemmas of decision-making under extreme circumstances, and above all, the resilience of the human spirit. We talk about the lives of specific members of the orchestra, their relationships, and how those individuals navigated their harrowing experiences. It's an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I'm delighted to be able to bring it to you. It's Anne Sebba on the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz. And welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to chat to you today.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you've written an absolutely fascinating book. And to start us off, can you tell us what prompted you to write it?
Well, do you want the long answer or the short answer? I'm a journalist by training, and my history has been writing about women in the 20th century. And my most successful book in terms of sales and popularity was about Wallis Simpson, because I found some extraordinary letters that really changed the whole version of events. But I did not want to be known as a royal writer, and I actually didn't see that as a royal book. Wallis was very definitely unroyal, but I had a clear choice at that point whether to go down the royal route and write about other royal figures, or to look at what really was my love, which was history. And although people think of me as a writer of women, and that's true, I actually think that my link is 1936 and wartime and that period. So I've always felt, how can you call yourself a historian of the 20th century if you don't actually deal with the central calamity? And that is the Holocaust. And yet I resisted because I'm not a survivor. I'm not the child of survivors. I'm not trying to be politically correct, but we all know the criticisms that are heaped on people if you write about a story that's not yours to tell. So I sort of shied away from it. I wrote a book about women in wartime France, and that took me to the camp of Ravensbrück. And then I wrote a very dark story about Ethel Rosenberg, a woman who was electrocuted in 1953 because she was accused of conspiracy to commit espionage. And that just appalled me to think of her in solitary confinement for 2 years and then to be killed as a young mother. So I was well used to writing about dark scenarios. And I was researching the concentration camp of Belsen, looking for my next story. And my son said to me, "I don't know why you always write about other people, Mum. Why don't you write about your own father? Do you know his story?" Sort of did. He'd been dead for about 30 years, but like many people, he didn't really talk about his war experience. I knew the broad outlines. And I knew the word Belsen had been mentioned, so I wondered what his connection was. And when I finally went to the National Archives at Kew, which is very close to me, no excuse for not going before, no excuse for not discussing this with my father, I found that he was there probably a couple of weeks after liberation. Liberation was April the 15th. And in his handwriting was an account of organizing the destruction of the lice-ridden hut because the British Army had to bring Belsen under control. It was really an appalling scenario of death and starvation and illness and disease that met the British forces as they liberated it from the Germans. And once I realized that my father was there on May the 24th, and I knew from this other research I'd done that May the 24th was a date when the remnants of the orchestra, because they'd been moved by the Nazis from Auschwitz to Belsen, they gave a Red Cross concert. I was there on the very day that these emaciated survivors were giving a concert in aid of the Red Cross, and it really blew my mind. I mean, it made a visceral connection. I couldn't leave the story. I have convinced myself that my father must have walked the same paths that these women walked, because once Belsen was semi-destroyed, there was nowhere else to go. He loved music. He probably went to that concert. I can't ever know that. But this is not a book about my father. I really do want to make that clear. There's one paragraph about my father. I'm giving you the backstory because you asked. That's what led me into it. But what I really wanted to discover was about the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, and so much about them. How did they survive? Why did they survive? What became of them afterwards? All those stories, which I know you'll be asking me. But that's how I became interested in the first place.
The bit that really got to me was you talk very briefly in the book about the fact that you'd seen something written in his own handwriting. These are conversations you could have had with him. And I think there's something really interesting about discovering something about one's family that would have been available. But as you say, even if you'd raised it, potentially he might not have wanted to talk about it, and clearly didn't in some respects because it wasn't talked about.
He was almost anti-intellectual. When I went to university and specialized in the 1930s, remember him joking and saying, "Oh, that's not a real degree. I lived through the 30s. You know, how can you call that history?" And he sort of dismissed it. That was his way. And it was his way when talking about the war. The war was reduced to about 3 or 4 choice stories. For example, he went over in a tank on D+1, fought in the horrific and bloody Battle of Caen. Wouldn't talk about it other than to say to me, "Oh, well, there was a little spaniel running around in the streets, and we took the spaniel as a mascot for the tank and kept it throughout the war." And I remember that spaniel called Liz, or I remember the stories. So he brought the spaniel back to England after the war. And the Battle of Caen was reduced to this story of a dog. Isn't that ridiculous? And then he went on up and into Belsen. And I do remember he mentioned Belsen, but he would say, "Oh, I wasn't there at the liberation," as if therefore it meant nothing. Presumably because so many others had been killed, he was promoted to third in command of the brigade at that point, and he was keeping the regimental diary. So yes, and he had a very distinctive handwriting. That was what I meant by the visceral moment, to see him sign these orders, talking about what suddenly became known as the DPs. It was a new word, displaced persons. We now call them refugees. But there were 60,000 of these skeletal creatures wandering around Belsen. The British were absolutely not prepared for this. We know the famous Richard Dimbleby broadcast that the BBC for several days refused to allow, because they said people won't believe this, won't be credible that there is such appalling signs of death and destruction, all these bodies lying around the streets and cannibalism. And then medical students went, and even the medical students said they weren't prepared for the stench and walking around in feces and urine and no food. And I mean, human nature had completely broken down by the time the British Army entered Belsen. So no wonder he couldn't talk about it. You know, I was a child. As I say, when I went to university, he thought I was doing what today we'd call a Mickey Mouse degree. It wasn't. It was modern European history. But it was so modern for him that he dismissed it. So I think all those things together perhaps explain why it was difficult to talk about. Most people after the war wanted peace, quiet, normality to bring their children up. in safety and security. We were a lucky generation. I say we, the baby boomers, but that's how I explain it.
And I think that inability to process is one of the reasons that when one comes across accounts like yours that take very human elements, it's almost impossible for any of us to process the scale of what happened. But we can start to process it if we hear individual stories. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting about what you've written in the book and the way you've approached it is that here is something that is human that we can all connect with on some level. And yet behind it is this horrific story that I think we all struggle. There's just no way that we can compute that.
Yeah. Well, you've hit on a number of interesting things. I have met survivors even before this book. And actually, before this book, I'd visited for my work 5 other camps. And I really hoped I'd never have to go to Auschwitz because I had a false view that it was a touristic site and I didn't want to sully what I knew from the other camps that have had minimal restoration. I was wrong. I mean, of course, I went to Auschwitz for this story, but it's unlike anywhere else. The industrial scale of the killing, there is still enough existing structure. Try and imagine. I say that with real difficulty because having met survivors, they all say you cannot imagine what this was like. And of course you can't, because even when I went on a November day that was quite cold in my thick down coat, I was freezing. And to imagine these women with no food, biting winds, so exposed there, having to tune their instruments with no gloves at 4 a.m. with roll call and nothing in their stomachs, and knowing that a Nazi boot or gun was an inch away. You know, all of that does make it absolutely impossible to imagine. And you know, one of the survivors that I really do want to mention, who was not in the orchestra, who had to listen to it. And I said to her, you know, was that in any way a release for you to have a Sunday concert and you sit there? And she said, no, it was just one more thing to be endured. I didn't know about music. And she told me how they had to sit on the ashes because of the smoke from the crematorium of human remains. They knew exactly what they were sitting on, still warm. But the other image that I have in my mind that helps explain, I think, why none of us, unless you were there, can really grapple with what it meant. She said, I just spent the afternoon extracting lice. I said, what does that mean? And she said, well, you just take whole handfuls out of your hair and you look at your hands and you see them crawling, and then you take handfuls from here and handfuls of lice, and they never go away. Being cold, hungry, emotionally distraught, not knowing what the future is, and spending the afternoon taking the lice out of my hair. I mean, how can you picture that scene unless you were there? You can't. So the only other thing I want to say in answer to that question is, in spite of that, what I try rigorously to do in all my books is, yeah, I do see myself as a storyteller more than a historian. I like to use historian tools, and accuracy is paramount. But ultimately, I'm a storyteller. I feel there's no point in writing these books if people aren't going to read them. But the bottom line is trying to think, what would I do? And having said all that I've said, you know that I'm going to reply, it's impossible to know what I'd do, but that's what I want my readers to think. If this were me, what would I do? And I think that's the only way to try and engage your readers.
And I'm fascinated by the approach that you adopt to this subject, because obviously there are still some survivors there that you could talk to, but how does one approach them? There's a wealth of archive material. It almost strikes me as being pretty overwhelming, both from a psychological perspective for you, but also, I guess, the wealth of material. There's memoirs about this that have been written. So you're collating accounts that are there with differing perspectives. I guess quite challenging in the sense of a lot of material, but also in terms of psychologically what you're dealing with.
You're completely right. So let's deal with the material. There is no shortage. And I'm terribly aware, as I hinted in my first answer, I am not a Holocaust historian. And some historians have spent their entire lives writing about this, and they will know in great detail what date, which transport arrived with how many people on it. And I had to start from scratch with all of that. And of course, I'm never going to know everything. So there comes a point where you have to decide, I know enough to write this story, even though I'm never going to know everything. And I do accept that I may have made mistakes. I've really sent it to people who are experts and asked them to check it because it's a fraught area. So masses of general books on the Holocaust. I like to think I was reasonably knowledgeable about it all just because I'm interested in it. I always have been. I wanted to write about this area for a long time. So I had a pretty good basic knowledge, but nothing like enough to cope with this bizarre, absurd, unbelievable story. And I didn't want it to be a biography of 50 women because that would be indigestible and unreadable. But somehow I had to give biographies of the main characters. And I did quite deliberately set myself the task that if the Nazis want us not to remember individual people, and particularly individual Jews, they want everyone reduced to a hairless, faceless, emaciated, skeletal body who just is a number. What my task is to bring back some humanity and tell their backstory. Who were these people? And bring them alive again. So I needed to know about the key members, let's say 40 or so key members. And I do in the book focus on probably 10, 20 of the main characters. And luckily, they have written their memoirs. So here's one of the problems. They didn't have notebooks or diaries in Auschwitz. They didn't have watches. They know what day it was, what was happening. So, of course, memories differ. And I'm well aware of Holocaust deniers who say, well, one says one says the other. Ergo, it didn't happen. No, we all have different memories of the same thing. So the memoirs are an enormous resource and very valuable to me. But actually, I said my prayers to Steven Spielberg every night because after Schindler's List, he set up the Shoah Foundation and he interviewed thousands of people. I haven't in any way plowed my way through all of that, but it has excellent finding aids. And you can type in the words women, orchestra, music, and mostly you will come up with women who either were in the orchestra or women who remember the orchestra. Because I really didn't want this just to be about women in the orchestra. I wanted it to be 360 degrees about the Nazis who set it up, about the other women prisoners forced to endure it, to try and build as vivid a picture as I could of what it was like during those 18 or so months that the orchestra was playing. So I listened to a lot of testimonies, audio and audio-visual testimonies, the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, Yale Fortunoff Library. There are many testimonies, and to have these beamed into your living room, I can't describe to you what it does because you feel like you're interviewing this person when they're in their 70s or 80s at a good time for them to look back and remember. And many of them break down as they tell their story. And you feel intrusive. I mean, I hesitate to use the word exploitative because that's what historians do. But I am aware, back to my remark at the beginning, is this my story to tell? A huge responsibility, a duty of care, if you like, to be as accurate as possible, not to sensationalize the story. I've really tried, I think I said somewhere, to write it in a flat tone. That's not quite right, but I didn't think it needed any more sensational adjectives. It's sad enough as it is just to tell the story. So between the live survivors, because I'm a journalist, so I always like interviewing people who are actually alive and really there. And I met two women from the orchestra, one in Israel who was 99, one in London who's 99, about to be 100, Anita Lasker. I spoke to their relatives. I'd met some relatives in New York of the Greek family. I mean, that's a whole tragedy on its own. And they were very articulate about the Greek experience. So relatives, books, memoirs, diaries, films made. There are a few documentaries. So there is no shortage of material. And my task, really, knowing that I wanted to publish for the 80th anniversary, is how to deal with this in 4 years. I normally take 5 years for a book. So for me, this was pretty intense.
And I wonder what part music played in your research. Were you able to listen to music? Were there certain types of music that you wanted to listen to or didn't want to listen to as you were doing this? Or do you not generally listen to? Because I would sort of imagine it would, given the subject, it could impact your relationship with music.
From the sublime to the ridiculous, two things to say. I decided to take piano lessons when I started this book. I'd learnt the piano as a child. Listen, my maiden name was Rubinstein. You can't be called Rubinstein and not play the piano. But I was no good at it. My sister was a professional pianist, so I decided I couldn't compete with her, so I'd give up. Anyway, I thought I would learn, and this is the ridiculous part of the answer to your question, to try and understand how really hard it is. And it's unbelievably hard. 3 or 4 years on, I'm barely improved. I couldn't possibly play with other musicians in an orchestra and keep time. I can just about play, a grade 3 Bach prelude badly to 4 or 5 years. So, and these girls had probably had 2 years in school playing the recorder. So that informed my understanding of what an incredible undertaking this was for Alma Rosé to coach these unformed kids. There are about 4 or 5 semi-professional musicians in the orchestra who had to carry the rest. But even if you were a third desk violin and just expected to play on the downbeat, boom da da, boom da da, you had to get it in time or Alma would be furious with you. So that's one part of the answer to your question. My relationship to music. I love music. I adore music. And it hasn't spoiled it for me at all. There's only one recording of Alma playing. It's Alma and her father in 1928 playing the Bach double violin concerto, which is gorgeous music. And one of my daughters played it when she was younger, so I'm familiar with it. You can find it on YouTube and it's crackly. And it just churns me up every time I hear it. So that's the sublime part of the answer to your question. I go to concerts, and there was a concert at the Wigmore Hall recently to celebrate the music in Auschwitz. Simply, everybody's talking about the music in Auschwitz. It hasn't been a topic of conversation for many years, and suddenly people are rediscovering music that they played. And at this concert, which was so bizarre, they played jaunty music with titles like "It's a Lovely Sunny Day," "When the Parcel Comes," because that's what the Nazis ordered them. They wanted pop music, film music. There was very little real, beautiful music, as you and I would describe it. In fact, because the orchestra was half Jewish, half Christian, but Jewish musicians were not allowed to play the music of the great German masters, so they officially couldn't play Beethoven or Wagner or anything like that. And they weren't allowed, Polish musicians weren't allowed to play Chopin because he was Polish. So, there was a very limited official repertoire. They didn't always obey that. And when Alma wanted to reward her musicians, she couldn't give them food or money or funds or anything. So she would play the Mendelssohn violin concerto, which is again among the most sublime pieces of music. And that was their reward because he was a Jewish composer and you weren't allowed to play that. So my relationship with music, it remains, I think it is the most sublime of all the arts. And the fact that it was perverted here and turned into a tool of torture hasn't spoiled my enjoyment. I'll finish just by saying what Anita Lasker constantly says: whatever else the Nazis did, they couldn't kill music. She is, of course, only half right because of the other members in the orchestra. Most of them could never go back to a real enjoyment of music, but it hasn't spoiled it for me.
And I think that's an apt moment to move into the obvious question, which is why on earth would you have an orchestra in a concentration camp? Can you just sort of explain what would give you a sense of the genesis of this? Because on the face of it, it seems completely at odds. But as one reads the book and thinks about it, it's not lost to the irony of the word instrument. I tend to think of music as a joyful, positive thing. But actually, in this case, this is a part of the instrument of terror.
Yes. Well, we should explain why was the orchestra there in the first place, because music was something that the Nazis had always used as an instrument of torture. They had forced prisoners to sing against their will as they were marching, and sometimes they would blare music out of loudspeakers to prevent people sleeping in the camp. So they used music always. Now, there were several male orchestras, by some accounts 15 in Auschwitz, but this is the only all-female orchestra in any of the camps or ghettos or prisons, and it is actually more accurately termed a girls' band. That's what they called it themselves. The ages range from 15 to 56, or a couple of older women. So I don't like to call it a girls' band. These were women, but there were teenagers in it. And it was a marching band to all except that initially it was used to make the other prisoners who had to go out to the sub-camps to work, to make them march in time. And because of the Nazi mania for counting, they had to form up in rows of 5, because then they could just count 5, 10, 15, 20. And the Nazis were always shouting at them for as the orchestra was playing, as they went out to work, and more heartbreakingly, as they came back from work, often with their colleagues half broken, half dead, and they had to carry them. And if they couldn't put their left foot forward in the correct order, there was a Nazi boot waiting to go in and kick somebody. And there are many memories of that actually happening. So that's the first purpose, to help the Nazis count them as an instrument to make them march faster and in time when they went out to work. The belief was that this would give the camp a more militaristic air. So people would say, oh, it's not a concentration camp, it's got military discipline here. Then to give it a more benign air, so that if they had visiting dignitaries, they'd say, oh, look, we have music here. This is not an extermination camp. So it was partly to camouflage that aspect. And then, although the orchestra did not deliberately play to people on their way to the crematorium, as the trains disgorged the deportees, because the music block 12, had been placed, probably deliberately, very close to the railway line, and they practiced or rehearsed all day long, newly arrived prisoners heard beautiful music. And several of them in these testimonies I was talking about would say, well, I heard wonderful music when I arrived. Hungarian music, Czech music. This was wonderful. I thought, this place can't be all bad if there's music here. And the Nazis, of course, did nothing to stop that, because it helped to create an atmosphere of calm for the new arrivals. So I think for all those reasons, orchestras were deemed a good thing. Now, why did this specific female orchestra start up? Because there was a female girl called Maria Mandel, who was moderately well educated. Instead of leaving school at 14, like many others, her parents had paid extra money to be convent educated for another 3 years. That's probably where she developed a love of music and probably was able to play the piano herself. Now, Maria Mandel came into the camp after Ravensbrück, where she had the most appalling reputation. As a beast, she would walk around with a short leather whip and would thwack anyone for minor infractions. If they had a small curl growing back, their hair had been shaven and they'd wear a headscarf. But if she saw a snatch of hair showing through to feminize this poor woman, she'd thwack them with a whip. So she was feared and loathed in equal degree, but she was having an affair with a Nazi architect who was much better educated than her, and she wanted to impress him with her cultural abilities. And there was a constant power struggle within the camp amongst the other female guards. Now, it was a patriarchal setup, so the women were always struggling to be recognized at the same level as their male superiors. And these orchestras were sort of owned by individual guards. They looked upon it as, this is my orchestra. So Maria Mandel had an idea that if she could set up an orchestra, it was both a prestige project and a passion project. She thought it would improve her standing vis-a-vis the male hierarchy. So she started out advertising or by word of mouth, looking for suitably musical women who could run it. And the person who volunteered was a woman called Zofia Tchaikovska. Tchaikovska wasn't really a musician. She was a Polish teacher who probably had some experience with school children leading choirs. So she had a bit of music in her head, nothing written down. But she was working on a demolition squad and volunteered immediately and persuaded Mandel that she was related to the great Tchaikovsky, of which there's no evidence at all, but Mandel fell for it. She liked the name. So poor old Zofia was really struggling to get an orchestra going. She brought in some Polish teachers who she knew, and they played a few Polish folk tunes. There were probably about 10 of them. And just when the orchestra was really tipping downwards, something amazing happened. A virtuoso violinist called Alma Rosé, who was the niece of Gustav Mahler, Jewish by antecedent, but Christian by birth and baptism, probably never been in a synagogue, ended up in the camp. She was in her 30s, so she was taken to the experimentation block for a pseudo-scientific experiment on fertility and sterilization. And knowing that she would probably die on the operating table, she said, "Can I have a last request? Can I play a violin?" And the other women in the block had no difficulty in finding a violin. I mean, that's one of the extraordinarily horrible aspects of Auschwitz. While it's the most terrible place on earth, it's also full of riches, because as people were brought to the camp, Jews were told, bring your most precious possessions, you'll be resettled in the East, and many of them brought fine instruments. So the warehouse, known as Canada, was full to the brim, teeming with amazing instruments. Somebody brought Alma a violin, and she played magnificently, and everyone knew immediately, this is no ordinary violinist. This is a very superior talent. So Maria Mandel was summoned to listen to her, and Mandel felt, this is the answer to my prayers. I'm going to save this woman. She won't have the operation, but on condition she sets up a women's orchestra in Auschwitz too, in Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were. So that's how the orchestra started, really in August 43, for about 8 months until Alma died mysteriously, the only one of the orchestra who did die, in April 44. So for 8 months, Alma developed this amazing orchestra, and she demoted Tchaikovsky. She didn't get rid of her. She made her the deputy and the room orderly, and she was quite good at navigating the boundaries between Poles and Jews, because this is when Alma doubled the size of the orchestra so that she could bring in more Jews. It had to be 50-50 Jewish and Christian. And this is the heyday of how the women's orchestra got underway.
And there's an incredible tension's probably the wrong word, but on the one hand, she instilled this it's almost disciplinarian approach, whether they were going to be professional and people needed to perform. On the other hand, there's a real sense in the book that she was also very generous in terms of letting people in who didn't necessarily have the requisite music talent, recognizing that that was a safer place than just being an ordinary inmate in the camp. And so there's this fascinating, and I guess the sense I had, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, I guess to a certain extent, the professionalism, for want of a better phrase, that she exhibited in terms of making sure everybody had to perform and you had to rehearse and all these sorts of things, I guess was to be able to maintain it, because clearly you can cover for a certain number of people. The thing still had to perform. And so she held very high standards there, but was also willing, it seems to me, to allow people in, recognizing the sort of safety aspect of it.
Well, you're absolutely right. Alma is a fascinating character, isn't she? Like all these fascinating personalities in history, there are many sides to her. She was complex. And I think one of the most interesting things is that she was not brought up Jewish. I mean, Gustav Mahler had converted to Catholicism, her uncle, her mother, Justine, who was Gustav's sister, likewise, her father, Anne Rosé, changed the family name and also converted. And so Alma did not see herself as Jewish. And yet, at this point, she took it upon herself to save as many Jewish lives as she possibly could, because she knew that Jews would go automatically to the gas chamber if they had no valuable work in the camp. I'm not saying it was easy for non-Jews, but they weren't automatically gassed if they could work in one of the other commandos, the sewing commando, the kitchen, the warehouse, or the secretariat. There were places where you could work if you weren't Jewish. But for Jews, if you were lucky, you got a job where you worked and probably died anyway. But the orchestra was a place of sanctuary, unquestionably. So we can come on to the minor privileges that Alma got for her girls. And she couldn't make the orchestra bigger than 45, 46, probably. But she kept some people on who weren't musical as her maids or as her orderlies, and several people who were musical but didn't have the right instrument, because you couldn't have a piano in a marching band. They were copyists or arrangers. She took vocalists, she took opera singers, partly because she knew that for the Sunday concerts that the Nazis loved, a bit of opera would go down extremely well. So she managed to save singers in that way, but they weren't part of the marching band. So all of this indicates, I think, Alma's really finest moment in life. It's why she should be recognized as a heroine. I think she is extraordinary. And had she continued as a violinist, she would have been good. She was talented, but she probably was not somebody that you would, she wasn't Paganini, Yehudi Menuhin. She was good, but we wouldn't be talking about her. But here, she really, to say she rose to the occasion is so inadequate to describe what she did against the odds, confronting all her fears, not allowing the other girls to have these fears. I mean, I think she was a disciplinarian, and there are a couple of occasions where I talk about her slapping, or, we don't know if it was a slap or just saying, stop crying, because you can't have an orchestra that's crying. You've got to focus on the music and play well. If you don't play well, we will all go to the gas. And that's why it's not a story of one person. It's not a story of a small group of two, or the interaction between this two and that two. No, it's the whole orchestra. It's because they were a team who pulled together in spite of their differences. 11 nations, different religions, even amongst the Jews. There were Orthodox, there were Zionists, non-Orthodox, conservative, assimilated. very, very different cultures who often argued, but they coalesced when it actually came to it. And that's all thanks to Alma. So unquestionably, she was a disciplinarian. It out of fear, but I think that's to undermine her. I have more respect for her than that. I think she saw it as the only way these people would survive if they had enough sufficient excellence that the Nazis needed them. As I say, not only for the marching, but once they saw the caliber of her performing, they had these 3-hour Sunday concerts. They'd kill thousands of Jews and then say, "Oh, I'm so tired. I need some beautiful music." And Alma could give them amazing operatic duets that she scored for four female voices from Rigoletto. I mean, this was hard work. She was often up all night doing all of this. So if any of them didn't play their best, she would coach them. And there are stories of even the best musicians like Anita, the cellist, being made to scrub the floor for a week because she'd played an F sharp, not an F natural. It at one level, it's hard to explain, but at another level, it goes back to you can't explain it unless you were there and living under this constant pressure of having to be your best. And so they rehearsed all day and they had a repertoire of about 200 pieces and they played them endlessly. But Alma completely knew that if she allowed standards to slip, they wouldn't be allowed to continue. So that's why she was a disciplinarian. And that's why being a professional performer mattered to her, that this was her really greatest moment.
As I listened to you and as I was reading the book, it's often tempting to sort of judgment is the wrong word, but to sort of come to views as to people. And I think we're encouraged by Hollywood movies and I guess children's fairy tales to a certain extent to sort of think in very binary terms about whether people are good or evil. And I wondered for you as you were going through, how easy is it to step back a little bit? I mean, you clearly recognize that none of us have any clue whatsoever what we would do in those circumstances, wherever we found ourselves, because we just can't know that. And so it struck me as it's fascinating because you do get to the richness of characters and you bring out both aspects of it, deliberately not setting out to paint people as one thing or another. I wondered how easy is it for you to suspend any sense of doing that, or is that just a natural function of the way that you look at the subject as a historian?
Gosh, that is a difficult question to answer. To analyze one's own methods is really hard. But I did train at Reuters, and you couldn't reach any conclusion unless you had two absolutely hard and fast sources for anything you said. I have tried wherever possible to let the actions and the words speak for themselves. I think it's a book where I leave out judgment as much as possible. For me, they were all heroines, and they're heroines mostly because they survived. Here are the Nazis trying to wipe out Jewish lives and Jewish culture. And these women survived, and survival is the number one form of resistance. Now, you may say it's not active resistance in throwing grenades on railway lines, but for me, survival is the way they resisted. So I hesitate to pick out any of them, but I'm going to, because I think Hilda stands out as really having a clear moral through line in everything she did in life. Hilda Grunbaum, to go back a step, was a German, well-educated, obviously intelligent, only child. Her father, because he was born in Poland, was sent back to Poland when the Nazis took over. So she lived just with her mother when war broke out. And she was offered a place on the Kindertransport to come to England, but turned it down because she didn't want to abandon her mother. Her mother was taken into prison. She did everything to spend her money on getting lawyers, getting her mother out. She got her mother out, but her mother was taken to a camp and killed anyway. So Hilda turned down a place for her own safety and security And why did she do it? She was a passionate Zionist. She believed in hope that to be a better future for Jews where anti-Semitism didn't play a role. And that guided her to behave to the best of her ability because she knew she would be judged. And the two things she did that stand out for me, when the Nazis separated the orchestra, after Alma's death, there was one other conductor who never really worked, Sonia Vinogradova. And then when the Nazis realized that the Russians were coming, they needed to evacuate Auschwitz and destroy all evidence of their evil deeds. They separated the orchestra and told the Jewish members to take their clothes off, abandon everything, leave their instruments, their blankets, their food, the lot, and get on a train. They were going to another camp. They didn't know where. And they were told they absolutely couldn't go back into the block for anything. Hilda disobeyed those orders. She went back into the block. I find this such a courageous act. It's scarcely credible. She went back into the block and collected a couple of books and diaries that had mattered to her. Faust was one of them, but Alma's notebook and diary, and a little red bag she'd sewn to carry the music in. And she took that with her to Belsen. She didn't take useful things like jumpers or food or blankets. She took these artifacts because she said, I know after the war, nobody will believe that we've lived through this. I mean, the historical foresight that there would be Holocaust deniers is extraordinary. And these artifacts are now in Israel at Yad Vashem. So that's one aspect that I find extraordinary. I've already talked about staying to look after her mother. And then when she was in Belsen, and she really became the unofficial leader, ensuring everybody had a fair share of the meager provisions. And they accepted her authority. She would start the soup going around the circle one day, and the next day she'd started a different person so that everybody had a fair share of the top of the soup or the bottom of the soup or whatever it was. It could barely be called soup. And when she was interviewed and asked what guided her, what made her behave in the way she did, she said that if I didn't do the best I could, what was going to be the point of survival? We had to show there was a purpose to surviving, to behaving in the best way we possibly could. And I can't say I live by that, but my goodness, I do try and remind myself of that sometimes because it's so hard to live by that. You know, you want to cut corners, you want to do something that's convenient. And Hilda just knew there was a right moral path that cut through all this. And she's an absolute inspiration. And I did see her at 99 in Israel. She made it eventually and has children and grandchildren. She's not alive anymore. But that's why my book finishes with this lovely photograph of her on her 100th birthday, because I wanted to finish on an upbeat. It is subtitled for a good reason, A Story of Survival. And I just do want to emphasize that although it's a ghastly story and you can't make Auschwitz into a better story, and I'm not trying to tell love stories or anything like that, it is just appalling. However, these women survived, and I find that redemptive. And I just wanted to end the book on that sort of upbeat, that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary things.
One of the things that I found really interesting about the stories is that in the same way that people are not, good and evil, is that often there are decisions to be made where there isn't a good decision. There isn't the obvious right answer. Sometimes you just have to make judgment calls in the moment. And I found myself thinking, this is difficult enough under normal circumstances, let alone some of the horrific physical and other conditions. And I wondered, as you were sort of thinking about how to write some of the decisions and processes, you have to sort of shrink down stories into manageable. How do you do that and really capture the essence of the experience? Because the more I reflected on each individual instance that you talk about, the more I sort of thought, well, there's a lot you could talk about here. And given you've got the evidence, that must be quite challenging.
Well, yes. How do you shrink it down? Well, If there's one event, I would try to give more than one interpretation from at least three of the people, if possible, if they all remember that event, to show the variety of memory. I think it's important to show how people remember things differently in different circumstances, depending on what was happening to them. But I may have shrunk it down too much. I honestly don't know. I wanted to keep the narrative focus going, and I could have digressed regularly into what was going on in their minds, but that would have been what we call psychobabble, I think, because I don't necessarily have evidence for that. Yeah, I wanted to write more about the second generation trauma when they left and how these episodes never left them. And second generation, actually, some people talk about third generation. But I think what I have tried to do is tell a factual story that does have a linear through line. Well, of course, I digress at times if I know how people are thinking. I mean, for an example, Flora, the Dutch accordionist, whose story I found very well. They're all potent and poignant and all those things, but um, she ended up marrying her dead sister's fiance, so effectively her brother-in-law. And I think they really loved each other. But she did write afterwards. She couldn't write her memoirs until much, much later in life. But she said it was 1946. We'd survived all this. It was wrong to marry Beppy and have children and not think about it. My head was still in the war. And that's the phrase that I remember, that even though it was a year after the war, she said, my head was still in the war and it was wrong to bring children into the war, when they were born post-war. So mostly I don't talk about what was going on in their minds because I can't know it for sure. And I'm trying to tell it with some economy, because otherwise it would be 800 pages and nobody would read it, but not at the expense of accuracy. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. Well, absolutely. Well, I can tell you, if it was 800 pages, I would be delighted to read it, because I think what I think is magical about the way that you write is your distillation of these things. In that there are details in there that I think you could have left out, put it that way, if you wanted a shorter version. And actually, there's a richness to it. And so particularly given the sort of work that I do, my interest in human decision making, some of the things in there, if, for example, you referenced it before, the tension within the orchestra and the different groups of people that were there. And I thought some of those insights were fascinating, pointing to some of the dilemmas and the challenges and the human nature of what was going on. Because part of me was expecting, there's a common enemy here. Here's the orchestra uniting. And yet within that, and understandably, because humans, we're not perfect and we don't all get on with one another. And why should we get on with one another? When you forced all these people together in a group, they're not automatically given that they will get on in a situation of high pressure. But you brought some of those things out beautifully. So I think you absolutely answered my question, but it was just some of the sort of psychological dynamics as to what was going on within the orchestra I thought were fascinating.
Yeah, and I did not want to write a book which was, here's a group who all came together and played beautifully, and they played lovely music. First of all, they did not play lovely music. I did not want to pretty up the story. The roll call where they stood often with diarrhea pouring down their legs. It was not a pretty sight. They did not look beautiful. But most of the arguments were about food, and anti-Semitism reared its head. Even these Polish resistors who had probably risked their lives and were in Auschwitz because they'd been anti-Nazi and had helped Jews. Even those people had this deep vein of anti-Semitism, which surfaced in the camp because they were starving and they had food parcels. I mean, most of the arguments were around very practical things like food parcels, because the Polish Christian women were allowed to receive food and the Jews couldn't. And anyway, there was nobody left at home to send them food parcels. So that there was this tension of, did the Jews have better contacts in Canada? Were they exploiting that? I mean, it was a absolute Tower of Babel in terms of the languages spoken, but also a microcosm of how human beings behave, and especially human beings under pressure. I mean, I'm fascinated by your question about decision making because there was so little scope for decision making. But of course, we all know Viktor Frankl's book and the search for meaning, but ultimately the one decision nobody can take from you is how you're going to behave in a given set of circumstances, what goes on in your mind. And that's really why I think Hilda is so extraordinary. But all of them, I must stop singling out Hilda because they all behaved heroically. And the Poles argued that they didn't want to share their food amongst the Jews because there wasn't much of it. And they felt that their own survival depended on staying within their own friendship group. So they did share with the Ukrainians and the Russians, but they just felt to separate it out amongst everybody won't help anybody. So that was a decision they took in answer to your question about decision-making processes. And the Jews just had to survive by scavenging or scrounging or whatever and managing and not falling out because their lives depended on ultimately when they played overcoming those differences. But there were differences, and there was no way I was going to write a book which glossed over all of that because clearly wasn't how it was.
And as you were researching, back to this idea that nothing is sort of binary and simple, were there moments of empathy would be the wrong word, but moments of humanity that you saw, or positive things that you saw on the side of the people running the camps? Because clearly they're human beings as well.
You're asking me to say, can I understand what went on in the Nazi mind?
Not necessarily, but I wondered sort of moments of, were there surprises in there in a positive sense? Because I think, again, it's very easy to have simple narratives with this subject. And I wondered if there's anything you came across, and the answer may be no. And that's,
Well, it's no, the answer is not no. They are human beings. And I think several things. I think even though people can be cultured and educated and love music, they're still capable of great bestiality and crime. So the two can live alongside each other. But in terms of the female guards, who had probably most to do with the women in the orchestra, I have quoted different views of some of them. That there was a woman called Margot Dressel, who most of the women absolutely hated and loathed. But there were a couple of people who I quote to found that she saved them. Now, she probably did something good out of self-interest, but nonetheless, there are different views of some of the guards. And Tchaikovsky, the conductor at the beginning, the Polish woman who struggled to get the orchestra underway, there are several people who felt that she behaved honestly and decently and absolutely did her best. Other people who feel that she was completely hopeless. I mean, she wasn't running the camp, she was running the orchestra, but she had different views and interactions with the Nazi Guard. And of course, Maria Mandel, the one who was responsible for getting the orchestra underway, was of course human. She didn't join the Nazi party until 1940. She didn't come from a big Nazi family. When she finally went on the run, she found that her father would have nothing to do with her. He was ashamed of her. So eventually she was found and caught and hanged in 48. But I think in trying to understand what drove her to become this sadistic Nazi guard, I would say probably it was rejection by men along the way. It was a desire to earn a decent living, and being a female camp guard gave you a very good standard of living and improved your status in Nazi society. So those are basic human emotions to understand and grapple with. But if I can be criticized, and I'm sure I can be, it's for not delving enough into trying to understand what makes a Nazi. This is very definitely a book about the cohesion and survival of the orchestra. And I certainly don't ignore the Nazi guards, but I can't say that's my biggest focus of interest to explain and understand the Nazi mind, except, as you say, that they are human and they were motivated by things we can identify with. Trying to impress a boyfriend is a fairly basic motive.
You've mentioned the anniversary, the timing of the publication, why you wanted to get the book out. And, sad to say that as one reads it, there are clearly echoes of what you have written about occurring throughout the world. And I wanted to, it's a slightly cliched question, but have we learned anything from that period? Do you think we've learned those lessons?
No, well, of course not. The only lesson in history is that there is no lesson in history. I seem to remember a tutor telling me that when I was a student. I think my final chapters about Belsen continued until 1950, and these stateless refugees with nowhere to go. And they were not all Zionists, but many of them were forbidden entry to America. There were quotas in Australia, in England. Where did they go? They couldn't go back to Poland. And understanding that Palestine was the only place they could go. I think you can't learn about this story and the end of the war without seeing the germs of where we are today. To say whether we've learnt from that, I happen to be not a supporter of Netanyahu, and how can one look at the desperate scenes of devastation without cringing over what's happening at the moment in the Middle East and Palestine? It's utterly, utterly appalling. But I can, I suppose, see this terrible sense of insecurity that the Israelis have from believing nobody came to help us before, so we're going to do it again. I'm not saying that's the right way to behave, but in looking at how we've got to where we are, of course one can see seeds of this conflict, because the state of Israel was not founded until 1948, and as a direct result of what has happened. It's just an unbelievable tragedy, and I wish more lessons had been learned instead of that particular lesson that nobody will come to our aid. Perhaps that's the wrong lesson to have learned.
And in terms of your future work, is there more you want to do on this topic, or are you pivoting to something else?
I haven't got a new subject right now. I'm still living in the zone here. And, I write. That's what I do. I tell stories, and I can't imagine a life where that's not what I do. But I need to be gripped and obsessed, and I haven't got the right story. If there's something you think I should write about, please tell me, because I will need another subject soon. I'm not there yet.
It very much struck me in the way that you talk about your research and your writings. You clearly have to be intrinsically motivated to want to do this. And that's why I wanted you to tell the story about how you came to write this. You don't strike me as being someone who sort of writes on commission, in the sense of somebody else will tell you, you have to want to do this because of the nature of the research. And that comes through in the writing. So I guess it's just a case of waiting to see where inspiration strikes next, as opposed to having someone else telling you what that should be.
Somebody could point me in the right direction. Somebody could tell me about some fascinating story, and I can get engrossed. I'm, to that extent, a journalist. Give me a deadline, say I want 5,000 words by tomorrow, and I'll do it. But you're right. I do need to feel this was such a passion project for me. I really needed to tell this story. And while there were people still alive, I just think we have lived through. I say we have lived through. I was born in 51, but that's only 5.5 years after the end of the war. And the 20th century was so horrific. 2 of these unimaginably vicious, violent, destructive wars. Where is civilization going? I don't have an answer to that question or any other. So I couldn't leave this story alone. And having done a lot of research, I'd love to write something else in this area, but I don't quite know what it is. So open to ideas.
Fabulous. Well, and as I knew time has just flown. I want to thank you for writing an absolutely incredible book for a story that obviously needs telling, but the way that you tell it was one of the most I won't say that I enjoyed reading the book because I think that's not the right adjective for it, but I found it absolutely fascinating and engrossing. It's one I want to go back into because I think it raises so many interesting questions. And as people will have detected from the way that you talk about it, clearly is a passion project. So I want to say thank you for writing an incredible book, and please keep writing and find the next topic that you want to cover, because there's just something amazing and you bring stories to life in a way that just is captivating and makes me want to read it again. So thank you for that. And above all, thank you for being an incredible guest on the show.
Well, I'm touched by your praise, slightly embarrassed, but very interesting when you say, I can't say I enjoyed it. Normally when an author signs a book or dedicates it, you say, I hope you enjoy this. I can't write that. So I've found a way around it. I say, I hope you embrace this story. So may I say to you, thank you for embracing this story. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and of course to Anne for appearing. To find out more about Anne, her remarkable book about the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, and some of the other topics that we talked about during the show, have a look in the show notes. You will find links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the show, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show. But in the meantime, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening.